Imagine, for a moment, a silence so absolute it feels heavy. Not the peaceful silence of a rural night, but the suffocating stillness of a world that has just been emptied. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic or the laughter of children, just nothing. The prophet Zephaniah begins his message not with a gentle nudge, but with a cosmic shockwave that rivals the story of Noah. He doesn't just predict a local war or a temporary famine. He speaks of a divine uncreation. He describes a God who is so weary of the rot, the blood, and the arrogance of humanity that he reaches for the delete key of the universe. "I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth," declares the Lord. To a modern American audience, this sounds like the script of a high-budget post-apocalyptic thriller. But for the people walking the streets of Jerusalem in 630 BC, this was a terrifying reality, crashing into their comfortable lives. They thought they were safe. They thought their religion was a shield. They thought their money was an insurance policy against God's wrath. Zephaniah was the man sent to shatter those illusions. Today, we are going to dive into one of the shortest yet most explosive books in the Bible. It is a journey through the darkest shadows of human history into a light so bright it consumes everything in its path. This is not just an ancient, dusty scroll. It is a mirror held up to our own world, our own hearts, and our own future. To understand the weight of Zephaniah's words, we have to look at the man himself. He wasn't a wild-eyed hermit from the desert. Zephaniah was royalty. He was the great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah, making him a distant cousin to the reigning King Josiah. He lived in the corridors of power. He saw the corruption of the elite from the inside. He spoke during a time of transition. The northern kingdom of Israel had already been wiped off the map by the Assyrians. Judah, the southern kingdom, was all that was left. Under the previous kings, Manasseh and Amon, the nation had descended into a nightmare of child sacrifice, occultism, and systemic injustice. Now, a young King Josiah was on the throne, trying to turn the ship around. But Zephaniah knew the truth. A few surface-level reforms weren't enough. The rot was deep in the bones of the people. They were settling on their dregs, believing that God was too distant or too indifferent to act. They said in their hearts, "The Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill." In other words, they believed in a God who didn't matter. Zephaniah's mission was to prove them wrong. He was the herald of the day of the Lord, a day that would change the definition of history forever. Get ready, because we are about to enter the storm. We are standing at the edge of a precipice. If you look down into the valley of the Book of Zephaniah, you don't see a pastoral scene of sheep and rolling hills. You see a cosmic storm front, purple and bruised, moving toward a city that thinks it's untouchable. Zephaniah chapter 1 is perhaps the most chilling piece of literature in the ancient world, because it describes the systematic uncreation of the world. Think back to the opening of the Bible, to the book of Genesis. There, God speaks into the void, and beauty emerges. Light separates from darkness. The waters teem with life. The air fills with birds. Man is given breath and dominion. It is a masterpiece of order and life. But here, in the very first verses of Zephaniah, we see the artist taking a razor to the canvas. God says, "I will utterly sweep away everything." This isn't a localized flood or a regional famine. This is a reversal of Genesis. He mentions the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the beasts of the field, and finally, humanity itself. It's as if God is saying, "The experiment of humanity has become so toxic that I am pulling the plug." Now, why such extreme language? To understand the why, we have to walk through the streets of Jerusalem with Zephaniah. As a man of royal blood, he didn't live in a vacuum. He saw the high society parties where the wealthy elite wore foreign clothes just to show off their status. He saw the temple courtyards where people were bowing to the God of Israel one moment and then turning to the rooftops to worship the stars and the constellations the next. This wasn't just falling away from faith. It was a deliberate, sophisticated insult to the Creator. The people of Jerusalem had become experts at syncretism, a fancy word for hedging their bets. They wanted the protection of Yahweh, but they also wanted the luck of the pagan gods like Baal and Milcom. They were religious shoppers, picking and choosing what felt comfortable. And this is where Zephaniah's message hits us, right in the 21st century. We live in a world of spiritual buffet lines, where we take a little bit of comfort from here and a little bit of self-help from there, but we rarely want a God who demands our absolute, undivided allegiance. Zephaniah screams into that void. You cannot serve two masters when the master of the universe is coming to claim his house. There is a specific phrase in chapter 1 that should make every listener pause. Zephaniah says that the Lord will search Jerusalem with lanterns. Close your eyes and visualize that. It's night, the city is quiet, but there is a divine light moving through the dark alleys, peering into the basements, looking behind the closed doors of the heart. This isn't a search for weapons or stolen gold. It's a search for apathy. God says he will punish those who are settling on their dregs. This is a metaphor from winemaking. When wine sits too long without being poured from one vessel to another, it becomes stagnant, thick, and tasteless. The people had become spiritually stagnant. They had developed a philosophy that is perhaps more dangerous than atheism. They didn't say God doesn't exist. They said, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. In other words, God is irrelevant. He's retired. He's a historical figure who doesn't interfere with my bank account or my weekend plans. Does that sound familiar? It's the practical atheism of the modern era. It's the person who goes through the motions of life, believing that there are no ultimate consequences, that the universe is just a cold machine, and that as long as they stay comfortable, nothing else matters. Zephaniah's Day of the Lord is designed to shatter that comfort. Listen to the cadence of his poetry as he describes that day. He calls it a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. It's a rhythmic hammering of doom. In Latin, this inspired the famous hymn Dies Irae, which has been used in countless films and musical compositions to signify the end of the world. Zephaniah wants his audience to feel the vibrations of the coming trumpet blast. He wants them to feel the walls of their fortified cities trembling. The prophet describes a scene of total chaos, people wandering like the blind because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood poured out like dust, their flesh like dung. It is graphic, it is violent, and it is meant to be a wake-up call. Why? Because the people had replaced their humanity with their wealth. Zephaniah notes that neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. In ancient Jerusalem, the merchant district was called the Mortar, a place where the sounds of weighing silver echoed through the streets. Zephaniah says those sounds will be replaced by wailing. Imagine the stock market crashing, the digital currencies vanishing, the luxury brands becoming worthless rags overnight. That is the atmosphere of chapter 1. It is the realization that everything we built our identity on, our careers, our status, our possessions, is nothing more than tinder for the fire of God's passion. But here is the deep theological twist. This isn't a temper tantrum. This is holy jealousy. The reason God is so angry in Zephaniah chapter 1 is that he loves his creation too much to let it rot in its own filth. He is like a surgeon cutting away a tumor. It is painful, it is bloody, and it looks like destruction, but the intent is to save what can be saved. As we move through this first chapter, we are forced to ask ourselves, if the lantern of God moved through our lives tonight, what would it find? Would it find a heart that is vibrant and alive? Or would it find someone settling on their dregs, lulled into a spiritual sleep by the comforts of the world? Zephaniah is the alarm clock that you want to throw across the room, but it's the only thing that can save you from the fire that is already starting to smoke on the horizon. The day of the Lord is near, Zephaniah says. It is near and coming quickly. The mighty man cries out bitterly there. The city gates, the fish gate, the second quarter locations that were the heartbeat of Jerusalem's economy are now the epicenters of its collapse. The prophet isn't just giving a sermon, he's giving a play-by-play of a disaster that has already begun in the spiritual realm before it ever hits the physical world. He ends this first movement with a terrifying summary. In the fire of his jealousy, the whole earth will be consumed, for he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. It feels like the end of the story. It feels like the curtain has closed. But in the world of the prophets, the end of our world is often the only way God can begin a new one. The roar of the first chapter begins to settle into a haunting whisper as we enter the second movement of Zephaniah's prophecy. If chapter 1 was the sound of a building collapsing, chapter 2 is the sound of the wind whistling through the ruins. But before the dust even settles, Zephaniah does something unexpected. He stops. He pauses the vision of destruction to offer a final, desperate plea. He turns his gaze from the heavens back to the people standing on the ground, and he utters a call to assembly that feels like a captain shouting to a sinking ship. He says, "Gather together. Yes, gather, O shameless nation." There is a raw, biting honesty in his voice. He calls them shameless, or in some translations, not desired. It's the image of a people who have lost their spiritual blush. They have done wrong for so long that they no longer know how to feel embarrassed by it. Yet, even to this shameless nation, the door is cracked open just a few inches. He tells them to gather before the decree takes effect, before the day passes like drifting chaff. Think about that image, chaff. The light, useless husks of grain that the wind blows away in an instant. That is how Zephaniah describes human history without God. It's weightless, it's fleeting, it's here one second and gone the next. And then comes the pivot, the threefold command that serves as the heartbeat of the entire book. Seek the Lord, seek righteousness, seek humility. This is the survival guide for the day of the Lord. But notice the humility in Zephaniah's own words. He doesn't say, "Do this and you will definitely be fine." He says, "Perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the anger of the Lord." That word perhaps is one of the most honest words in the Bible. It reminds us that we don't manipulate God with our rituals. We don't put him in our debt. We throw ourselves on his mercy and we trust in his character. The prophet is calling for a remnant, a small group of people who are defined not by their power or their bank accounts, but by their meekness. In a world that admires the loud, the aggressive, and the self-made, Zephaniah suggests that the only people who will survive the storm are those who know how to bow. Once this plea is issued, Zephaniah's vision expands. He stops looking only at Jerusalem and begins to sweep his gaze across the horizon like a lighthouse beam of judgment. He looks to the west, the east, the south, and the north. He is showing us that no one is outside of God's jurisdiction. If you are listening to this in a modern context, it's easy to think of God as a private, religious idea. But for Zephaniah, God is the international court of justice, the commander-in-chief of the elements, and the sovereign of every square inch of the map. First, he looks west, toward the coast, to the land of the Philistines. Cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. These were the ancient rivals of Israel, the proud seafaring nations. Zephaniah predicts a total evacuation. He describes a scene that would have been unthinkable to the merchants of that day. The bustling seaports becoming meadows for shepherds and folds for flocks. Imagine the skyscrapers of Manhattan or the docks of Los Angeles being turned into grazing land for sheep. That is the scale of the reversal he is describing. But there is a reason for this desolation. God is clearing the land so that the remnant of the house of Judah, those humble seekers he just mentioned, can find a home there. The ruins of the proud become the inheritance of the humble. Then the prophet turns his eyes to the east, across the Jordan River to Moab and Ammon. These nations were distant cousins to Israel, but they had become bitter enemies. Their sin wasn't just violence, it was taunting. They stood on the sidelines and mocked the people of God during their times of suffering. They were arrogant, puffing themselves up, claiming they were better, stronger, and more favored. Zephaniah uses a terrifying comparison here. He says they will become like Sodom and Gomorrah, a land of nettles and salt pits, a waste forever. Why? Because they scoffed and boasted against the people of the Lord of hosts. This is a warning to every culture and every individual who finds joy in the downfall of others. God hears the taunts, He hears the whispers of the arrogant, and in the economy of God, pride is a debt that always comes due. Next, He glances south, to the distant land of Ethiopia, or Cush. It's a brief, one-verse mention, but it's powerful. He says, "You also, O Cushites, shall be slain by my sword." In the ancient mind, Cush represented the very ends of the earth. It was the faraway place. Zephaniah is making a point. Distance is no defense. You can run to the edge of the map, you can hide in the most remote corners of the world, but the sword of divine justice, which is really just the truth of things, will eventually find you. Finally, the prophet turns his gaze to the north, to the superpower of the age, Assyria and its legendary capital, Nineveh. To a person in the 7th century BC, Nineveh was the center of the world. It was the exultant city. It was a place of massive walls, glittering palaces, and a military machine that had never been defeated. Nineveh said in her heart, "I am, and there is no one else." Does that phrase sound familiar? I am. That is the name of God. Nineveh had committed the ultimate sin. It had deified itself. It believed it was the source of its own existence, the master of its own destiny. Zephaniah describes the fall of this superpower in hauntingly beautiful, eerie detail. He says God will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. He describes the desert owl and the screech owl nesting in the tops of its ruined columns. He describes the voice of the birds singing in the windows while the cedarwork is stripped bare. It's a picture of nature reclaiming the machine. The city that thought it would last forever is now just a playground for wild animals. People passing by don't look in awe anymore. They hiss and shake their fists. This second chapter is a masterclass in the transience of power. It forces us to look at our own Ninevehs, our own institutions, our own empires, our own technological achievements, and ask, is this built on the sand of pride or the rock of humility? Zephaniah is telling us that the map of the world is constantly being redrawn by the hand of God. The great nations are brought low, and the small people, the remnant who seek righteousness and humility, are the ones who end up inheriting the earth. As we conclude this section, we see that the day of the Lord is not just about punishment, it's about clearance. God is clearing away the weeds of pride, the thorns of mockery, and the structures of oppression to make room for something new. He is a gardener who has to pull up the invasive species before the true harvest can begin. But the question remains, what about the city at the center of it all? What about Jerusalem, the city that should have known better? That is where Zephaniah turns his attention next, and the message gets even more personal and even more intense. The prophet's gaze, which has just traversed the entire known world from the western coasts of Philistia to the eastern deserts of Moab, and from the southern reaches of Cush to the northern ruins of Nineveh, now returns home. It settles back onto the hills of Jerusalem. But this return is not a homecoming in the joyful sense. It is a courtroom scene where the star witness is the city itself. Zephaniah chapter 3 begins with a woe. In the language of the prophets, a woe isn't just a warning, it is a funeral dirge. It is a cry of deep, agonizing grief for something that is dead, but still walking. He calls Jerusalem rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. Think about the irony here. This was the city of the temple. This was the place where the Shekinah glory of God was supposed to dwell. It was meant to be a lighthouse for the nations, a center of justice and beauty. Instead, it had become a black hole of corruption. Zephaniah points out 4 specific failures. She listens to no voice, she accepts no correction, she does not trust in the Lord, and she does not draw near to her God. To an American audience today, this list feels uncomfortably modern. Listening to no voice is the hallmark of our echo chamber culture. Accepting no correction is the refusal to admit we might be wrong, preferring our own truth over objective reality. Not trusting and not drawing near are the symptoms of a society that has replaced the living God with the idols of self-reliance and technology. We have the same symptoms that Zephaniah saw in the streets of Jerusalem 2,600 years ago. But then Zephaniah gets specific. He looks at the four pillars of society and he finds them all rotten to the core. First, he looks at the princes, the political leaders. He calls them roaring lions. In the ancient world, a king or a prince was supposed to be a shepherd, but these leaders were predators. They viewed the people not as a responsibility, but as prey. They used their power to devour rather than to defend. Second, he looks at the judges, the legal system. He calls them evening wolves that leave nothing for the morning. Visualize a pack of wolves that hunts at twilight. They are so ravenous, so consumed by greed, that they don't just take what they need, they strip the bone bare. There is no mercy, no thought for the future, only the immediate satisfaction of their appetite. When the justice system becomes a machine for the greedy, the society is already in its death throes. Third, he looks at the prophets, the media, and the influencers of the day. He calls them fickle, treacherous men. These were the people who were supposed to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Instead, they spoke whatever would keep them in the favor of the elites. They were light in the sense of being weightless, without conviction, blowing whichever way the political wind shifted. Finally, he looks at the priests, the religious leaders. He says they profane the sanctuary and do violence to the law. They took the holy things of God and made them common. They twisted the scriptures to justify their own lifestyles. They made religion a tool for status rather than a pathway to holiness. Behind this wall of human corruption, Zephaniah points to a startling contrast. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no injustice. Every morning, without fail, he brings his justice to light. This is a powerful image. No matter how dark the evening wolves make the night, the sun still rises. God's character is the only thing in the universe that is truly consistent. He watches. He waits. He gives the nations chance after chance to learn from the ruins of their neighbors. But Jerusalem, Zephaniah says, was only all the more eager to make all their deeds corrupt. This brings us to the refining fire. God decides that if the city will not change through words, it must change through fire. But listen closely to the intent. He says, "My determination is to gather nations, to pour out upon them my indignation." However, the goal isn't annihilation, it's transformation. In verse 9, we see one of the most beautiful promises in the Old Testament. "For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord." This is the reversal of the Tower of Babel. At Babel, human pride led to the confusion of languages and the scattering of the people. Here, the day of the Lord leads to a unified language of worship. The remnant emerges from this fire. They are described as a people humble and lowly. They will seek refuge in the name of the Lord. They will do no injustice and speak no lies. They will pasture and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. This is the peace that passes understanding. It's not a peace built on military might or economic surplus. It's a peace built on the character of a God who has pruned away everything that is false. Now, we reach the summit. If the book of Zephaniah were a symphony, this would be the moment the minor key suddenly shifts into a triumphant, soaring major key. The clouds break, the thunder stops. The sun floods the landscape. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The prophet is no longer shouting woe, he is shouting joy. And why? Because the judgments have been taken away. The enemy has been cleared out. But more importantly, the King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. Think about the psychological impact of those words. For generations, the people lived in fear. Fear of the Assyrians, fear of the Babylonians, fear of the day of the Lord itself. But when God is in the midst, fear dies. The presence of the King changes everything. And then we find the verse that has sustained millions of people through their darkest nights. Zephaniah 3:17. This verse contains 4 incredible descriptions of God's heart toward you. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He is not a passive observer. He is a warrior king who has won the battle. He will rejoice over you with gladness. Think about that. The creator of the galaxies looks at the humble remnant, the outcasts, the lame, the broken, and he experiences gladness. He will quiet you by his love. This is the image of a mother holding a crying child. After the storm of judgment, after the chaos of life, he pulls us close, and his love becomes a blanket of silence that settles our anxious hearts. He will exult over you with loud singing. This is perhaps the most mind-blowing concept in the Bible. We are used to the idea of us singing to God, but here, God is singing over us. The Hebrew word for exult implies spinning around in a dance of joy. Imagine the King of the universe dancing and singing because he has brought his children home. The book ends with a promise of restoration. God says he will save the lame and gather the outcast. He will change their shame into praise. At that time, I will bring you in, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes. The fortunes being restored aren't just bank accounts. It is the restoration of our humanity. It is the restoration of our relationship with the divine. It is the end of the exile. Zephaniah started with the uncreation of the world, and he ends with the recreation of a people. As we close this deep dive into Zephaniah, I want to take a moment to look at the big picture. When we read this in 2026, it's easy to feel like this is just ancient history, but Zephaniah is writing about a reality that is already and not yet. In the past, these words were a literal warning to Judah. They ignored them, and Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC. The day of the Lord arrived in the form of fire and exile. In the present, Zephaniah speaks to the Jerusalem in all of us. He speaks to our apathy, our settling on the dregs, and our tendency to trust in our silver and gold rather than the living God. He reminds us that justice isn't a suggestion, it is a divine necessity. He calls us to be the humble remnant in a world that is loud, arrogant, and shameless. He offers us the invitation to be hidden in the love of God. In the future, Zephaniah points us to the ultimate restoration. Christians see the fulfillment of Zephaniah 3:17 inches, Jesus Christ, the King who came into our midst, the mighty one, who saved us not through a sword, but through a cross, and the one who will return to finally wipe away every tear and lead the eternal song of joy. The message of Zephaniah is a bittersweet symphony. It is bitter because it tells us the truth about our sin and the consequences of our pride. It is sweet because it tells us that God's final word is never judgment. His final word is song. He is a God who would rather refine us through fire than lose us to the dark. Thank you so much for journeying through this incredible book with me today. This has been a long and intense exploration, and I hope it has stirred something in your soul. If you found value in this story and this analysis, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who might need to hear that God is singing over them today. What part of Zephaniah's message resonated with you the most? Is it the warning about apathy or the promise of the King's love song? I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps this channel grow and allows us to bring more of these life-changing biblical stories to life. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will continue to unearth the treasures of the Scriptures. Until then, remember, seek the Lord, seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you too will be hidden in the day of His grace. God bless, and I'll see you in the next story.